Rain needles the city into a single shiver as alarms chew the air, and in the fluorescent hush of the isolation bay, Dr. Lila Armon steadies the world, with hands that sometimes will not obey her. She remembers the night a man in a black suit, a genius with a grin like a scalpel, laughed at the tremor she could not hide. She remembers applause that drowned her name. Tonight a patient bleeds from places that should not bleed, and the monitor ticks like a metronome for courage, while the glass beyond the bed reflects a woman who refuses to vanish. Somewhere across the skyline, cameras light another stage where certainty is sold in glossy bottles and precision is posed for shareholders. But here, breath fogs a visor. Prayer is a sterile gown, and irony arrives in an unlabeled tube of blood, cooling in her palm. First proof that what is killing them was made by those who said she was too fragile to hold a cure. The sample is anonymous in the way confessions often are, stripped of stories and names, just numbers and the whisper of a chain of custody, too tangled to trust. Lila moves through the essays like a pianist relearning a piece every day, muscles uncertain but memory precise, each plate a stanza, each stain a chord. Patterns emerge where nothing should align. A receptor-binding domain soldered with a motif she's seen, in a helix forge preprint, spliced where nature would hesitate. She feels the ache in her shoulder as a clock, winding down faster than she admits. Across town, Soren texts a map of symptoms that sharpen into a radius around a single tower. She thinks of Cassian's voice cutting across a conference stage, of laughter not at the data but at the body that dared hold it. She has always understood that sickness is not a flaw in character. Tonight she understands it may be the archive that saves them. Helix Forge unveils a gene therapy pledge as the city's ambulances braid blue light through the rain. Cassian stands inside a ring of cameras and says words about safety that never learned to blush. Evelyn nods beside him, gaze held at a point past accountability. In the hospital, Mara threads 4 felines into skin that is human and frightened, and never invited this experiment. Every beep is a metronome counting what leadership costs when it mistakes charisma for ethics. Father Jonas drifts between beds with a pen and small cards of prayers he never forces, listening the way a scientist listens for signal in noise. The pathogen blooms fast and mean. Lacing alveoli with glass, Soren triangulates clusters on a digital map that pulses like a guilty heartbeat. Lila, with the tube that started it all, watches a band on a gel sharpen like a verdict and knows at last that design, not chance, is staring back. The first death comes with a quiet that humiliates rhetoric. A woman whose name the chart folds into codes exhales and does not return. The ventilator keeps breathing as if loyalty could conjure her back. Mara's eyes bright with work that has no place to put its anger. Lila's hand on her sister's shoulder, anchoring them both. Soren arrives with a question he already knows will hurt. Could the spike be binding to an acetylcholine-related pathway that her illness has mapped for years? She thinks of her own antibodies like stubborn archivists, cataloging invaders, annotating weakness into knowledge. Father Jonas stands in the doorway and does not preach. He simply counts heartbeats with them, and when the last one does not come, he folds his hands. Lila decides to test her serum, a trespass against her body that feels like consent, because the alternative is a room that will not stop filling. In the micro room, it is just glass, steel, and the will to be exact. Lila spins down her own blood and watches the centrifuge translate fatigue into layers, separates serum the color of old honey, and labels it with the care of naming a child you intend to protect. She thinks of the conference stage, the laughter, the way humiliation is a solvent that strips varnish from memory, until only structure remains. If she is right, her disease has etched an answer into her. If she is wrong, she will waste the last clean hours the city has. Soren waits with a stopwatch, speaking softly about controls. Mara stands guard at the door like courage, given a badge. Beyond the glass, Evelyn's world tightens, and Cassian's pulse, counts the distance from arrogance to need. Lila lifts a pipette, and for a breath, her hand is still as law. Morning breaks in a color that can't decide between mercy and rust. The case map on Soren's screen blossoms into a constellation that makes the city look like a lung riddled with glass. Clusters pinwheel out from Helix Forge meetings, concierge clinics, a gala that sold hope at the price of PL. Secrecy. Lila sifts overnight assay readouts and feels her body negotiating with itself. A quiet bargain between weakness and will. Mara moves triage like a conductor, improvising beds from corridors while Father Jonas writes names on index cards. So no one is just a number when the tally is told. On television, Cassian apologizes for confusion, as if language were the pathogen. Evelyn calls Lila with a voice engineered for reassurance, asking for collaboration, offering resources with strings woven so thin they look like light. Lila hears the offer as a test, whether the cure must pass through the hands that created the wound to be believed. The hospital corridors widen into a river of bodies. A boy with a paper dinosaur, a banker whose tie has become a tourniquet for courage, a janitor who keeps mopping because he cannot fix the air. The pathogen does not learn our hierarchies. Lila calibrates her prototype assay against her serum, and the curve arcs cleanly, as if certainty had a signature. She texts Soren a string of conditions for any partnership open data, audit trails, patient families at the table, watches the typing bubble appear, disappear, return with the word yes. Mara intercepts a pharmaceutical rep trying to badge his way into isolation with promises of expanded access that smell like futures. Father Jonas slips a card into Lila's pocket. Repair is not the same as return. Outside, sirens choral the block. Lila finally says out loud that bodies like hers have been footnotes in trials. The cure will not arrive as a favor. It will arrive as a fact. Helix Forge's lobby smells like lemon and litigation. Lila and Soren walk past a waterfall wall that tries to baptize reputation, their visitor badges blinking red as if the building knew. Evelyn greets them with chin-level warmth and a contract thick as a winter coat. She says the word partnership and pronounces it sanctuary. Lila places her conditions on the table, each one a vertebra aligning the spine of the work. Raw data mirrors, independent oversight, reparations fund, the right to publish without prior restraint. Cassian arrives late, color drained to expensive porcelain, a cough folded into a fist. For a moment his eyes meet Lila's, and there is no press, no stage. Only two bodies that must tell the truth to their blood. He says he trusts her. She replies that trust is auditability with teeth. The room inhales. Somewhere down the hall, a centrifuge starts, the tone of a clock that has chosen acceleration. By evening, the first attempt to replicate Lila's biology without her consent detonates in whispers. A junior scientist from Helix Forge found hypotensive after a reckless infusion, a backdoor protocol scavenged from screenshots and Dan. Hubris. Soren's call is quiet, but the words hit like steel. Lila's anger arrives not as heat but as clarity. This is how systems behave when outcomes threaten margins. Mara's fury is simpler. She wants names. Father Jonas tells her that anger is a tool, not a meal. Lila drafts a public letter that says what she has avoided saying. Patient-authored science is not a trend, but a boundary, and there will be no cure traded for silence. Evelyn texts that the situation is contained. Cassian texts nothing. The city count jumps by 12. In the mirror, Lila sees her own shoulders square in a way that is not defiance but design, a geometry matching the work ahead. The rain pauses as if the sky itself needs breath. Lila returns to the micro lab and builds the scaffold for the therapy with movements that remember their own purpose. She programs a rapid cycle expression run, grafting her antibody architecture onto a neutral backbone and embedding kill switches Soren suggested, so no one can weaponize what was born to men. Mara stands at the door, a sentinel made of coffee and worry. Cassian finally calls, voice raw with the smallness illness teaches. He does not beg, not yet, but the distance between his words and the floor has shortened. Evelyn emails revised terms that tighten like wire. Lila replies with a single sentence linking to an open repository where the protocol now lives under a permissive license. The decision is not a confession or a condemnation. It is a path. She presses start on the run and feels the room lean toward the future with her. In the hush between alarms, Lila sketches her ultimatum on a legal pad as if drawing a bridge over a canyon she refuses to fall into again. The autologous platform nested in her body is no longer a secret. It is leverage braided from pain and precision. And she will spend it only in a currency that buys repair. Soren sits across from her, measuring silence the way he measures risk, his steadiness a scaffold for the fierce architecture of her terms. Radical transparency, open datasets in real time, restitution to families, whistleblower protections and the right to publish without Helix Forge's varnish. Mara circles the room like a small storm, wanting justice to wear a face and a name, pressing Lila to demand safety for herself before the sit. Father Jonas' note lies between coffee rings. Forgiveness is power when it chooses its object. Lila signs the page, not as plea or threat, but as the first protocol most likely to save the most lives. Helix Forge's negotiation suite smells of citrus and control. Evelyn opens with condolences that land like paper birds, then gestures toward a contract that tries to launder history with new signatures. Cassian, thinner now, listens as if his body were a courtroom where each cough is a gavel. Lila does not raise her voice. She describes the platform, the antibody architecture born from her disease, the triple fail-safes that prevent misuse, and the conditions that anchor the science to the people it serves. When she names the reparations fund and the real-time mirror of every dataset, Evelyn's pen pauses, the smallest flinch in a face trained not to move. Cassian says yes too quickly, then slower, as if learning consent in a language he never needed before. Soren reads the room like a contact trace. Lila ends with a simple sentence. The cure will not be proprietary. The air changes, not cooler, just truer. Like a lab when the hood finally draws. The city tilts toward evening and with it the balance of power. Evelyn proposes an advisory delay on publication to ensure quality, a phrase that arrives like velvet over a blade. Lila counters with a public registry time stamped to the minute, governed by an independent board, seated with families of the sick. Cassian's voice cracks on a question about prognosis. For the first time, he speaks without an audience, and the room does not know what to do with the truth of it. Mara texts Lila photos from the overflow Wardaboy's paper dinosaur, perched on an IV pole reminding her who the protocol belongs to. Soren suggests escrow of IP in a civic trust, language Evelyn pretends not to hear until Lila repeats it, slower, as if instructing a reagent to bind. The final draft takes shape like a bridge built mid-air. Cassian signs first, hand shaking. Evelyn last, smile fixed like lacquer. Lila uploads the framework while her heart steadies to a working rhythm. Back at the hospital, the world narrows to air, blood, and the grammar of enzymes. Lila prepares the first compassionate use batch under the new accord, her movements paired to essentials, her breath measuring the cadence of the hood fan. Father Jonas stands outside the glass, a witness without intrusion, offering a nod that reads like a benediction written in practical ink. Mara guards the door and the clock. Soren calibrates the kill switches with her, line by line, until the code feels less like a trap and more like a promise that the cure cannot be conscripted into harm. When Lila pauses, it isn't fatigue, is awe at the fact that her body taught her this language. Every flare a footnote, every remission a margin, where a theorem was penciled. She feels the old humiliation recede, not erased, contextualize the solvent spent, the structure intact. The vial clears as if deciding, and the protocol advances one careful step toward a living chest. Night draws the hospital into a single organism humming against the dark. The first candidate for infusion is not Cassian, but a nurse from the early cluster whose lungs have turned to lace. Lila explains the risks with a voice that refuses theater. The family nods, bravery returning their faces to themselves. She thinks of Cassian waiting somewhere in a private room, of Evelyn counting outcomes against stock, of a boy's paper dinosaur, of the platform her illness gave, and the boundary she built to protect it. Soren verifies the chain of custody. Mara scripts the crash cart like a lullaby with teeth. Father Jonas holds a small card and doesn't offer it, simply stands close enough that presence can be borrowed. Lila's hand is steady. The room is quiet. The infusion begins like a sentence that has been struggling to find its true subject, and when the first monitor line softens, no one speaks, as if language might jar the future from its path. The city wakes to a siren chorus, and a headline that rips the quiet veneer from Helix Forge. An unauthorized replication has burned a scientist from the inside, and the rumor hardens into panic before the facts can dress themselves. The hospital fills with the grammar of fear half-truths, screenshots, a video of a gurney rolling under blue. Lights, and Lila feels the public temperature rise like a fever no antipyretic can touch. Soren's voice through her headset is a metronome. Confirm. Verify. Publish. Mara posts a blunt triage notice and turns hallways into arteries that actually move blood. Father Jonas writes names on cards for families pressed against glass, reminding the building it is made of people, not throughput. Evelyn calls to insist on context. Cassian doesn't call at all. Lila opens a camera, points it at her bench, and says on record that her body is not a patent but a precedent, and she will proceed where evidence and duty intersect, not where fear demands spectacle. By afternoon, evidence surfaces like bones in low tide, time-stamped messages, reagent orders, a camera log with 12 missing minutes. Lila watches Evelyn wield language like glass transparent, until it cuts suffering, co-ownership, and a communications shield, if Lila will delay the live stream and sign a mutual non-disparagement. Soren's analysis lands in her inbox like a verdict. The failed replication cribbed from an internal deck. Someone tried to synthesize her biology by approximating her disease. Mara wants the names read aloud. Father Jonas reminds them that truth without mercy becomes a weapon, and mercy without truth becomes anesthesia. Lila clicks the mic on and reads her conditions again, voice even, hands calm. Public mirrors, independent oversight, reparations now, and no gag orders ever. Outside, sirens plate the dusk. Inside, the camera's red light holds steady as a pulse, and the room decides what kind of institution it will be when no one is looking. Cassian arrives without entourage, and with the humility illness engineers when it pries your future loose from your schedule. In a quiet consult room stripped of optics, he sits with his shoulders caved, hands folded like a man learning prayer late. The cough is smaller now, but meaner. He speaks to the floor first, then to her, admitting shortcuts, the panel where he mocked her tremor, the grant he quietly buried with a phone call because her body made investors uneasy. The words do not redeem him. They correctly weight the ledger. Lila listens the way she reads a gel looking for bands that confirm design, not vibes. She tells him the protocol will proceed, that it will be recorded, that his survival cannot purchase silence. Soren steps in with consent forms fat as novellas. Mara hovers with a stare that could file charges. Father Jonas waits in the hall, not as absolution but as witness. Cassian signs, and the room resets its air. The bargain is inked in clauses and reinforced in architecture. Soren and Lila build a digital deadman switch that publishes everything if their heartbeats stop broadcasting. Mara programs the access rota so no one walks in alone. Father Jonas gathers family, advocates for the oversight board, so the protocol never drifts from the people it serves. Evelyn submits red lines that try to sand off the teeth. Lila restores them and adds molars. Cassian watches with the posture of a man reacquainting himself with limits, signing where the document tells him to and nowhere else. Outside, the protest decrescendos into a vigil. Candles stippling wet pavement. Inside, Lila records a walkthrough of the lab, naming equipment not as props, but as instruments of care. When she finishes, the room doesn't applaud. It exhales, a body resetting after a arrhythmia. The work will either dignify the hands that do it, or it will not be done. Midnight gathers every clock into one. The city has thinned to reflections, the hospital to intent. Lila stands at the threshold where plan becomes act. A camera humming, a protocol open on the screen, a vial that holds the argument her body made over years of being underestimated. She feels the familiar flutter in her hands, acknowledges it like an old critic who sometimes taught her the right questions, then sets her wrists against the bench and finds stillness. Soren reads back the checklist. Mara counts instruments like rosary beads with teeth. Father Jonas offers no scripture, only a borrowed steadiness. Cassian lies in the isolation room beyond the glass, smaller than his story, watching the woman he once mocked choose the terms of his future. Lila taps the record icon, looks straight through the lens as if addressing more than the room, and says, "Begin." The run spins up, a low animal purr, and the world tilts toward procedure. Time fractures into protocol steps and braided breaths. Lila signs her own consent like a surgeon and a subject in the same skin, then rolls up her sleeve while the camera records not drama, but clarity. The harvest is small by design. A vial of possibility spun from a vein that has memorized needles and made peace with their grammar. Soren reads the checklist in a cadence that anchors the room, counting redundancies as if abundance could be manufactured from caution. Mara stands at the door with a gatekeeper's stare and a sister's tenderness, filtering interruptions into silence. Father Jonas sits near the wall and writes down the ordinary words no one will quote later. Warm, steady, presenso. They are not lost. Cassian waits behind glass, tethered to monitors that make his breath legible. Lila names each step aloud to the record, blessing precision with transparency, and when the blood turns in the tubing like a steady comet, no one speaks. The lab becomes an engine that runs on restraint. Lila centrifuges the harvest and skims the serum, the color of old amber, while Soren verifies barcodes and timestamps against mirrored drives. They move like a duet that refuses flourish, converting biography into blueprint. Isolate, encode, express. She loads the construct into the bioreactor with a reverence unbeholden to myth, only to the thousands of quiet hours that made this possible. Mara threads a line from the UPS battery pack to a generator and tapes every plug like talismanic stitches. Father Jonas reads the names of patients aloud, a litany that keeps the work from tilting into abstraction. Cassian's vitals dip then steady. He watches the room that contains his future and does not ask to be its center. Lila programs the kill switches, triple checks the sequence, and hits start. The vessel hums, low and certain. And around it, the team builds a kind of temporary country called procedure. Sabotage doesn't kick the door, it whispers. A courier call goes dark, a reagent shipment pings to the wrong dock. A security badge denies at the worst possible minute. Soren catches the pattern first and routes a detour through a university freezer. 2 districts away, mapping a relay like a field medic planning an evacuation. Mara turns into logistics with teeth, drafting volunteers and an off-duty EMT to form a human chain of cold boxes through rain. Evelyn's office sends an email labeled clarifications that reads like latency and trust. Lila ignores it and keeps the reactor on pace, nursing a creeping tremor in her fingers by bracing her wrist against steel. Father Jonas stations himself by the service elevator with a cart and a borrowed badge, bending rules toward mercy. Cassian's cough becomes glacier, thinner. The clock becomes a drum. The boxes arrive sweating cold. And for a breath, the entire team exists as a single. Disciplined, yes. The synthesis completes to a tone that sounds like a throat finally clearing. Lila draws the first dose with hands that remember every slight and choose usefulness anyway. Soren reads out the chain of custody, while Mara confirms bedside crash protocols in a voice that leaves no room for hesitation. Cassian looks smaller than his legend, the handsome edges sanded to a person. He thanks Lila without theater. She nods, not granting absolution, but acknowledging the gravity of being alive in the same room, with a choice. Father Jonas stands just outside the glass, neither officiant nor audience, simply present. The drip begins, a pale thread entering a body that built its own catastrophe. And the monitors draw a new grammar across the screen, jagged easing, oxygen edging upward, pressure finding a shore. Lila does not watch his face. She watches the data and the line in the room, and she logs each minute as if testimony could be a form of care. Some victories are audible only to instruments. The saturation climbs another point, then two. The flush returns to Cassian's mouth like a rumor of summer. Lila logs the trend and feels the room ease, a fractional relaxation that does not yet allow relief. The tremor that she has out-argued all night surges, bright and insistent. She rides the wave by anchoring her forearm along the bench, breathing through the flare while Soren casually shifts the pen to her steadier hand. A choreography learned over years. Mara's shoulders drop for the first time in days. She texts a single word to the family floor, rising. Father Jonas writes nothing now, simply shares the silence. Evelyn's message arrives asking for a statement. Lila replies with a link to the public dashboard where the curve lifts. She will pay for this steadiness later. For now, she chooses not to fall. The drip continues. The room holds. The city outside remembers how to hope. Morning arrives like a verdict, softened by coffee and exhaustion. Cassian is no longer drowning, only learning how to breathe where water once ruled. His oxygen line hisses a domestic counterpoint to sirens that finally recede from the block. Lila signs off on the night's notes and feels the recoil and ache in joints and jaw that reminds her victory isn't free. Soren's dashboard blooms with downward trends in ICU admissions. Mara's messages come clipped and practical, each one a breadcrumb back to ordinary duty. Evelyn releases a statement congratulating our partners with the grace of someone setting a stage she didn't build. Father Jonas folds flyers for the family's vigil into neat stacks. A cathedral made of copy paper and resolve. The cure is no longer a rumor, but a reproducible scaffold. And with it comes the oldest tension in medicine: who owns relief? Lila looks into the lens and says the word together as if it were a binding agent no board can price. Relief invites revisionism. Evelyn's team drafts a narrative where collaboration began earlier and culpability later, where oversight was always the plan and patience were stakeholders in theory. Lila reads the release and feels the old heat rise, but it focuses into a razor instead of a fire. She gathers Soren, Mara, and Father Jonas and outlines a publication blast. Raw datasets mirrored to civic servers, annotated protocols, a ledger of decisions that refuses to let courage be retroactively branded. Cassian, lodged between gratitude and shame, asks what repentance looks like that isn't a press conference. Lila says repair, not rhetoric. Fund the families, end the secrecy clauses, publish the chain of mistakes so others don't repeat them. Outside, the vigil lights bloom against wet pavement, like a city remembering tenderness. Inside, the upload bar crawls across a screen. When it completes, the room breathes in a way that sounds like agency taking root. Truth, once public, moves like weather. Researchers in other cities ping the repository and replicate the scaffold within hours. Clinicians send videos of monitors easing, lungs relearning grace. With The attention comes threat lawyers with clipped vowels, offers wrapped around warnings, an investor memo that calls open science a brand risk. Lila reads it and thinks of the boy's paper dinosaur riding an ivy pole like a flag, remembers why she refuses to let care be privatized beyond recognition. Soren fields inquiries with the serene ferocity of someone who believes governance is a form of love. Mara screens every call, funneling hate into nowhere and help into hands. Father Jonas keeps the vigil quiet, refuses to let cameras turn grief into spectacle. Cassian asks for the microphone at a press briefing and, for once, uses it to subtract himself from the center, naming the dead and the death. The city listens, and something unclenches inside Helix Forge. Walls begin to speak. An audit trail Lila insisted on is impossible to bury. Emails time-stamped between ambition and negligence surface, and with them, a rotation of executives who prefer compliances to conscience. Evelyn moves like a chess player in a fire, sacrificing statements to save the board. She arrives at the hospital with a proposal to create a joint institute under corporate stewardship. The offer glitters the way traps do. Lila counters with a public institute seeded by Helix Forge funds but governed by cities and patients. The science irrevocably open. The board chaired by people who have waited behind glass. Cassian, pale but standing, says he will resign and endow the transition. Evelyn's smile tightens into geometry. Mara steps closer to Lila in a choreography that reads as shield. Soren slides a term sheet forward like a verdict. Father Jonas watches the small muscles and faces where decisions make history. By night, the city is quieter. Not cured of harm, but inoculated against a certain kind of lie. The protocol lives in mirrors around the world. The vigil candles gutter to smoke and memory. Cassian sleeps without oxygen for the first time in weeks. Evelyn drafts a resignation that reads like strategy and consequence braided together. Mara convinces Lila to sit. Just sit. In a dark lab where the instruments hum like a choir warming up. Soren places a printout of the dashboard curve on the bench and draws a small star at the inflection point. Father Jonas sets a single tea light on stainless steel and says nothing until silence does its work. Lila thinks of the stage where mockery taught her how to stand, of the corridor where rage learned to be a tool, of the serum whose color she will always recognize as the shade of a promise kept. She does not forgive or forget. She chooses the next step, which is different and harder. Building something that outlasts her. The hearing room smells of varnish and raincoats steamed dry by too many bodies. Microphones sit like honest little machines waiting to decide whose air becomes record. Lila reads from a ledger that is not vindictive, but exact. The dates, the omissions, the work, the open mirrors. The committee chair thanks her in a tone that mistakes composure for ease. She lets the silence afterward do the correcting. Evelyn's counsel says the word context. Until it collapses under its own weight, Evelyn watches her reflection in a silver carafe as if the water might reframe her. Cassian speaks without costume, confirming the shortcuts and the cruelty, his voice thinner than the man who once sold certainty by the yard. Mara's hands stay laced on her knees, a semaphore spelling patience. Soren names governance as care, the dead man's switch as consent engineered into infrastructure. Father Jonas writes the names of the lost on cards he will hand to no camera. The transcript acquires a pulse. The memorial does not repair the world, but it repairs the way the world speaks about the dead. In the courtyard, candles turn the wind into a choir of small, stubborn lights. Photographs lean against bricks as if resting. Lila's voice is steady as she names the first nurse who said yes to risk and taught the protocol to walk. She names a janitor, a bus driver, a grandmother whose laugh outlived her lungs on home videos. Someone screens on a bedsheet. Cassian stands among families who do not owe him audience and listens as if attendance were labor. Evelyn does not speak. Her absence has its own grammar. Mara reads statements from patients who recovered and asked for anonymity, their gratitude a private architecture. Soren thanks the volunteers who became a logistics system with beating hearts. Father Jonas lifts no doctrine, only a pause in which grief can be a full sentence. The city answers with soft applause that sounds like breath returning. Contracts arrive with their favorite illusion that ink can do the whole work of a future. Lila insists on windows in the rooms where decisions will be made, and language that keeps those windows open. The institute is public, its board chaired by families, its protocols irrevocably open source, its budget a ledger anyone can audit. Cassian announces his resignation and endowment without flourish, as if subtracting himself could be an offering, rather than theater. Evelyn signs with a smile lacquered into place, then sets down the pen as if it might testify. Mara adds a clause for worker safety that reads like a hand on the small of the city's back. Soren finalizes the mirrors, and the heartbeat fails safe, embedding durability into design. Father Jonas blesses nothing. He simply witnesses the signatures like coordinates mapped onto a coastline we can now sail without pretending there are no reefs. Outside, sirens drift into the ordinary distance reserved for weather. After the speeches dissolve into coat checks and taxis, Cassian finds Lila in a quiet stairwell that smells of metal and rain. He thanks her in plain language, not as a performance but as an inventory of debts. The life she returned, the limits she enforced, the mirror she held to his certainty. He asks the question people ask when they want release: to have a receipt tear, we forgiven. Lila answers with the only calculus that makes sense to her. Forgiveness is not a door he gets to walk through, but a room she built so others may enter safely. Repair is the work. Repentance is payment on a ledger that has recurring charges. He nods, not bowed, but altered. A man whose center of gravity has moved. She offers him a single condition going forward. When policy and comfort collide, choose the wound that yields repair. He says yes without looking for applause. The stairwell light hums to a steady, unremarkable pitch. Morning breaks clean for the first time in weeks, a pale sky rinsed of theatrics. In the new wing, students and nurses cluster around benches where labels are written like promises instead of passwords. Lila unlocks a cabinet and releases a small parade of pipettes with the care of setting tools at a place where work and dignity meet. She teaches the protocol not as a relic, but as a living grammar that can travel without her, embedding attention into hands that will inherit the room. Mara commandeers clipboards into a choreography of readiness. Soren spins up a class on audit trails as an act of love. Father Jonas chalks a schedule for family advisory hours in handwriting that steadies a wall. Cassian arrives late and takes a seat in the back, learning to be audience. No one claps. They practice. Lila looks through the glass to a city, reflecting the hospital's light back into itself, and understands the final cut is not an ending. It is a standard.